Some stories were never meant for the public. Not because they were small, but because the people who witnessed them understood that what they saw wasn't entertainment. It was something deeper, something personal,
You think you're ready
something
for
that
this?
changed the way they
Show
understood
me your
strength.
focus!
On a
Now!
quiet afternoon inside a modest training space in California, a man walked in wearing the calm confidence of someone who had survived things most people could not imagine. He was a Navy SEAL instructor, known among his peers as James Hawkeye Morrison, a man who had trained warriors, broken recruits, rebuilt them, and taught them how to function under fear, pain, and chaos. He had heard the name Bruce Lee. He had heard the stories, and he didn't believe a word of them. To him, martial arts demonstrations were choreography, philosophy was weakness, and speed meant nothing against real combat experience. When he stepped into the dojo that day, he didn't come to learn. He came to expose what he believed was an illusion. Only 8 people were present when he looked at Bruce Lee and said the words that would later become legend, "Come fight a real man." What happened next was never recorded, never advertised, and never spoken about publicly for years. But the 8 who saw it walked out with a completely different understanding of what combat really meant and what true power actually looks like. The room itself was nothing impressive, and that was the first thing that unsettled Morrison. He had expected something more theatrical, something built to impress civilians. Instead, the training space was clean, simple, almost quiet in its energy. No trophies displayed for admiration. No banners shouting achievements. Just wooden floors, training equipment, and a handful of students moving with focused intensity. Morrison had spent years in military training environments where toughness was loud, aggressive, and constantly tested through pressure. Here, the atmosphere felt controlled, deliberate, almost calm to the point of being uncomfortable. He watched for a few minutes without speaking, arms folded, eyes scanning for weaknesses. What he saw confused him. There was no rigid form repetition, no strict traditional patterns being drilled endlessly. Instead, students were moving freely, adjusting, experimenting, reacting. Bruce Lee walked among them not like a distant master, but like a scientist observing a living experiment. Morrison's worldview had been built in environments where survival depended on direct results. He had trained men to fight in unpredictable environments, in close quarters, under exhaustion, under fear, sometimes under real fire. In his mind, combat was not philosophy. It was violence, efficiency, and control under chaos. When someone had mentioned Bruce Lee to him weeks earlier, describing him as the fastest fighter alive, Morrison had laughed. Speed meant nothing if the opponent didn't freeze. Technique meant nothing if the opponent didn't follow the script. Real combat, as he understood it, was messy, brutal, and unscripted. And yet, as he stood there watching Bruce Lee move, something about the man's presence made him hesitate before speaking. Bruce Lee noticed him immediately. He always noticed the energy of a room, especially when someone entered carrying tension instead of curiosity. He approached Morrison calmly, without confrontation, without the performative authority many instructors relied on. Morrison introduced himself simply, mentioning his background in the Navy SEALs, his role as a combat instructor, and then, without softening his tone, he said what he had come to say. He told Bruce Lee that military hand-to-hand training was designed for real combat, not demonstrations. He said martial arts looked impressive, but wouldn't hold up against someone trained to fight without rules. He didn't shout. He didn't insult directly. But the message was clear. He was challenging the legitimacy of everything Bruce Lee was teaching. The students stopped training, not because Bruce Lee told them to, but because the shift in the room was impossible to ignore. Bruce Lee listened without interrupting, and that alone frustrated Morrison more than any argument would have. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even pride. Instead, Bruce Lee nodded slightly, as if the challenge itself was nothing unusual. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost conversational. He didn't defend martial arts traditions. He didn't talk about philosophy. He said something that Morrison didn't expect. He said that most martial arts were indeed limited, trapped in forms and traditions that didn't prepare people for real unpredictability. He said that combat was not about style, it was about adaptation, about interception, about ending conflict as efficiently as possible. This was the first moment Morrison's confidence shifted slightly, because what Bruce Lee was describing sounded less like a traditional martial artist and more like someone who understood the same realities he had seen in military training. Bruce Lee explained that his entire system, what he called Jeet Kune Do, was built on the principle of removing what was useless and keeping only what worked under pressure. No fixed patterns, no rigid stance loyalty, no style identity, just efficiency, speed, timing, and directness. Morrison listened, but skepticism was still stronger than curiosity. Words were one thing, results were another. That was when he said it, "Come fight a real man." There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. The room went silent. Bruce Lee didn't react immediately. He studied Morrison the way he studied everything, observing posture, breathing, weight distribution, eye movement. Morrison stood like someone used to physical confrontation, balanced, grounded, confident in his strength and conditioning. He was taller, heavier, and physically built for endurance and impact. Bruce Lee, by comparison, looked almost lightweight. To someone unfamiliar with him, he would not appear intimidating. Bruce Lee finally nodded once. He asked the students to step back. There were no gloves brought out, no protective gear, no formal setup. That alone made Morrison feel more comfortable. This wasn't going to be a demonstration, it was going to be a real exchange. Before they began, Bruce Lee said something that none of the 8 witnesses would forget. He told Morrison that real combat is not about winning a fight. It's about ending danger as quickly as possible while minimizing risk to yourself. He said strength matters, conditioning matters, but timing and awareness matter more. He said most fighters focus on power, but real combat is about interception, hitting the opponent in the moment they decide to attack, when their structure is committed and their balance is vulnerable. Morrison nodded, but inside he still believed experience would outweigh theory. They stepped into distance. Morrison made the first move. And in that instant, something happened so fast that half the witnesses later disagreed about exactly what they saw. Before Morrison's forward movement fully developed, Bruce Lee had already moved. There was no chambering, no visible preparation, no dramatic motion. A straight lead shot forward like a reflex rather than a technique. Morrison's head snapped back slightly, not from heavy impact, but from the shock of being touched before his movement had even completed. It wasn't a knockout blow. It wasn't meant to be. It was something more unsettling. Interception. Morrison reset immediately, this time more cautious. He circled, testing distance, looking for the moment to close in. He had fought trained men before. He knew how to pressure. But every time he shifted forward, Bruce Lee adjusted distance with small, efficient footwork that wasted no energy. No bouncing, no unnecessary movement, just constant control of space. Then Morrison committed more aggressively. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, but every witness later described the same feeling. They realized they were watching a different level of efficiency. Morrison stepped in with forward pressure, reaching to clinch and control, the way military close-quarters training often emphasized. Before he could establish contact, Bruce Lee's lead hand struck again, twice, followed by a low-lying kick to the thigh that disrupted Morrison's base. As Morrison adjusted his balance, Bruce Lee had already stepped out of range. No exchange, no struggle, No extended fight, just entry, interception, disruption, exit. Morrison stood still for a moment, not hurt, but thinking. That was when Bruce Lee spoke again calmly. He said that real combat is not about trading techniques. The longer a fight lasts, the more unpredictable it becomes. The goal is not to engage. The goal is to finish the encounter before the opponent can organize their attack. Morrison asked to go again. This time, he approached slower, trying to read movement. Bruce Lee didn't wait. He closed distance first, fast enough that Morrison later admitted he never saw the initial step. A controlled strike stopped inches from Morrison's throat. At the same moment, Bruce Lee's foot was positioned to sweep his base if the strike had continued. He held the position for 1 second, then stepped back. No drama, no celebration, just silence. Something had shifted in the room, but the biggest change was inside Morrison. Because for the first time he realized he hadn't been fighting a martial artist. He had been facing someone who approached combat the way elite military strategists approached conflict. Efficiency, control, minimal movement, maximum result. And that realization would lead to a conversation after the encounter that none of the 8 witnesses expected. One that would reveal the real lesson of that day, and why the man who walked in to prove something left questioning everything he thought he knew about fighting. After the second exchange, the energy in the room changed in a way that none of the 8 witnesses could fully explain at the time. It wasn't the tension of a fight anymore. It was the quiet weight of realization. James Morrison stood still for a moment, breathing evenly, not exhausted, not injured, but mentally recalibrating. Years of military conditioning had trained him to read situations quickly, to assess threats, to identify weaknesses. What unsettled him wasn't that Bruce Lee was fast, it was that nothing Bruce Lee did was wasted. There was no excess motion, no emotional reaction, no desire to dominate or impress. Every movement had purpose, and every pause carried control. Morrison had entered the dojo expecting to expose illusion. Instead, he was beginning to understand that what he was seeing was something closer to applied combat science than traditional martial arts. Bruce Lee didn't rush to continue. He didn't pressure Morrison or try to turn the moment into a lesson for the students. He simply stood relaxed, hands loose, breathing calm, eyes attentive but not aggressive. That calmness affected Morrison more than the speed or the techniques. In military training, intensity was often loud, shouting, commands, stress conditioning. Bruce Lee's intensity was quiet, internal, and completely stable. Morrison stepped forward again, this time not as a challenger trying to prove superiority, but as a professional testing something he had begun to respect. Again, Morrison said, but his tone had changed. This time, he didn't rush. He circled slowly, observing distance, watching Bruce Lee's center line, looking for tells, shoulder tension, weight shifts, breathing patterns, anything that might reveal intention. What he noticed instead was unsettling. Bruce Lee didn't telegraph because Bruce Lee didn't decide early. His movement seemed to originate from reaction rather than pre-commitment. He wasn't preparing techniques. He was responding to energy, timing, and space. Morrison feinted forward. Before the motion fully developed, Bruce Lee's lead hand flicked out. Not a full strike, just a touch to the forearm, disrupting the line and forcing Morrison to reset. It was subtle, almost minimal, but it carried a message: your intention is already visible. Morrison adjusted and tried a different approach. Instead of committing to forward pressure, he shifted angles, attempting to close distance from outside Bruce Lee's direct line. For a moment it looked promising. He moved faster, cutting the angle aggressively, reaching to establish body control. Bruce Lee didn't retreat. He stepped in. The entry was explosive but controlled. A straight lead stopped short at Morrison's face, while Bruce Lee's rear hand positioned to control the arm. At the same time, his lead leg checked Morrison's forward movement at the knee line. Morrison's structure collapsed slightly, not from force, but from disruption of balance and timing. Again, Bruce Lee disengaged immediately. No follow-up, no escalation, just entry, control, exit. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Morrison exhaled slowly. In military combatives, the goal was domination, overpower, control, neutralize. What Bruce Lee was demonstrating was something different: deny the fight from ever developing. The students watched silently, but what they were witnessing wasn't a sparring session. It was a collision of two different combat philosophies. One was built on endurance, aggression, and resilience under chaos. The other was built on interception, efficiency, and preventing chaos from forming. Morrison stepped back and shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in reluctant respect. "Your timing," he said. "You're not reacting. You're ahead." Bruce Lee smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I'm not ahead. I'm just not late." That line stayed with Morrison for years. They didn't continue the physical exchange after that. Not because Morrison couldn't continue, and not because Bruce Lee was avoiding it. It was because the objective had already been achieved. Morrison hadn't been overwhelmed by power. He hadn't been beaten down. What he had experienced was something more difficult for a professional fighter to accept. He had been controlled without the fight ever truly happening. What followed next became the real lesson of the day. They sat on the edge of the training floor while the students quietly resumed practice, though their attention remained fixed on the conversation. Morrison asked direct questions, the way instructors do when they recognize something valuable. "How do you train for that kind of timing?" Bruce Lee explained that timing wasn't trained through memorizing techniques. It was trained by removing hesitation. Most fighters, he said, think in sequences, block, then counter, then follow-up. But real combat doesn't give time for sequences. The mind must act without delay, and that only happens when unnecessary techniques and rigid patterns are eliminated. He talked about economy of motion, the idea that speed is not moving faster, but moving less. He explained that strength matters, conditioning matters, but structure and efficiency multiply both. He described how emotional investment in fighting, anger, ego, the need to win, slows reaction and clouds perception. Morrison listened carefully because everything Bruce Lee was saying matched something he had seen in elite operators. The best fighters weren't the most aggressive. They were the most calm under pressure. They didn't waste energy. They didn't chase conflict. They ended it quickly. Bruce Lee said something that shifted the conversation from technique to philosophy. "The most dangerous fighter," he said, "is the one who doesn't want to fight, but is ready." That idea resonated deeply with Morrison. In military training, the goal wasn't to create men who loved violence. It was to create men who could remain controlled when violence became unavoidable. One of the students later recalled that this was the moment the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The encounter was no longer about martial arts versus military training. It was about understanding that real combat principles were universal when stripped of tradition and ego. Morrison stood up after the conversation and looked around the dojo again. The space no longer looked simple to him. It looked focused, intentional, efficient, just like the man teaching inside it. Before leaving, he said something quietly to Bruce Lee, something none of the students heard clearly at the time, but Morrison later shared years afterward. "I came here to prove you wrong," he said. "What you're doing, this would make soldiers better." Bruce Lee nodded. "Good," he replied, "because fighting is the same everywhere, only the uniforms change." There was no handshake for the audience, no dramatic ending. Morrison simply gathered his things and walked out the way he had entered, calm, composed, but carrying something different with him. Among the 8 witnesses, no one spoke much after he left. Training continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. They had expected a confrontation. What they had seen instead was something far more powerful: the absence of ego. Years later, when a few of those students spoke privately about the encounter, they all remembered the same thing. Not the speed, not the techniques, not the near-miss strikes. They remembered how quickly the conflict dissolved once respect replaced the need to prove something. That was the real lesson of that day, because the story was never about Bruce Lee defeating a Navy SEAL, and it was never about a Navy SEAL challenging a martial artist. It was about what happens when 2 systems built for survival meet, and both recognize the same truth. Real combat is not about style. It is not about tradition. It is not about strength alone. It is about awareness, efficiency, control under pressure, and the discipline to remove ego before it gets you hurt. In the years that followed, Morrison reportedly incorporated elements of what he had learned into his own training approach, not techniques copied directly, but principles: economy of motion, interception, emotional control, and the idea that the fastest way to win a fight is to prevent the fight from ever developing. As for Bruce Lee, he never spoke publicly about the encounter. That wasn't his way. He wasn't interested in stories that made him look unbeatable. His entire philosophy was about continuous learning, adaptation, and the understanding that truth in combat is never owned by one system. But for the 8 who were there, the memory never faded, because they didn't witness a fight. They witnessed mastery without ego. And that, more than speed or power, is what real strength looks like. Now I'm curious, from which part of the world are you watching this story? And if you believe stories like this, stories about discipline, mindset, and real strength, should reach more people, make sure you subscribe and become part of this journey.